It's a striking new image of the kidnapped suspect at the home of Savannah Guthrie's mom. It was created by internet sleuths using a technique called reverse infrared technology and shows features like eyebrows, flesh, and parts of a mustache.
It began the moment someone first decided her routine was worth learning. Now bring the new surveillance footage back into focus. Because this is where the timeline becomes extraordinary. If investigators have obtained footage that was not previously part of the evidentiary record, and if that footage captures something from the days or hours surrounding Nancy's disappearance that places a specific, identifiable presence in her environment before the crime occurred, then the pre-crime surveillance theory does not remain a theory anymore. It becomes documented. And documented pre-crime observation, captured on camera, is one of the most powerful forms of evidence a prosecutor can present. Because it does not simply show that a crime occurred. It shows that a crime was constructed. It demonstrates planning. It establishes intent. It transforms the entire legal architecture of the case from reactive to premeditated. That is why analysts were reportedly stunned. Not because the footage showed something violent, but because it may have shown something deliberate, something patient, something that, when placed alongside the January 11th and January 23rd footage requests, begins to form a picture of an operation that was running silently around Nancy Guthrie for weeks before she ever disappeared. She went to dinner on January 31st with no reason to believe anything was wrong. And yet, according to what investigators may now be seeing on camera, the preparation around her may have already been complete. That realization does not just change the investigation. It changes the question of who investigators are actually looking for. Because someone capable of this level of sustained, hidden preparation is not an impulsive actor. They are a calculated one. And calculated actors leave a very different kind of evidence trail than the kind most people expect to find in a case like this. The cameras were already running. And somewhere in that footage, a pattern may have finally become a face.
And the flashlight he held in his mouth? We bought a similar one for $30. The backpack is also drawing a lot of attention. Internet sleuths say it may be an Ozark brand, which has similar straps and reflective bands.
A black glove found approximately 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home. That was one of the early physical details that surfaced publicly in this investigation. And to most people following the case from the outside, it registered as an odd, isolated detail. A single piece of evidence with unclear context. Something that could mean everything or nothing depending on which direction the investigation eventually moved. But investigators do not see discarded items the way the public does. To a forensic analyst, a discarded item is not an endpoint. It is a coordinate. It marks a location. And locations along a potential escape route tell investigators something that crime scenes alone cannot tell them. They reveal movement. And movement reveals decision-making. And decision-making under pressure reveals the psychological architecture of whoever was responsible. Where was the glove discarded? Was it accidental or intentional? Does the location align with logical exit routes from Nancy's neighborhood? Does it suggest the person moving away from her property was following a planned corridor or improvising under stress? Every one of those questions matters. Because the glove did not appear in Nancy's home. It appeared 2 miles away. That distance implies transport. And transport, in an investigation like this, is one of the most evidence-rich phases of any criminal event because movement leaves traces that are extraordinarily difficult to fully eliminate. Now layer the biological evidence on top of that. Investigators reportedly identified multiple unidentified male DNA profiles tied to critical evidence in this case. Multiple profiles, not one. That detail carries enormous investigative weight because a single unidentified DNA profile suggests individual contact. Multiple unidentified profiles suggest something broader. They suggest that more than one person may have been present. More than one person may have been involved. More than one set of decisions may have been made. And that possibility transforms the case structurally.
His clothes are also producing intriguing clues. That ski mask has unique stitching. Notice the seams around the eyes and mouth. It's just like this mask, which can be bought for $22. The holster isn't fancy at all. It's made of nylon and sells at sporting goods stores in Tucson, also for $22.
Because if Nancy Guthrie's disappearance involved more than one participant, then the investigation is no longer looking for a single point of failure in someone's story. It is looking for the weakest point in a network. And networks, by their nature, are only as strong as the most vulnerable person within them. This is where the million-dollar reward structure becomes operationally significant. Publicly, reward money appears to be a tool for generating tips. And it is. But it functions as something else simultaneously. It destabilizes silence. It introduces financial pressure into relationships that may have been held together by loyalty, fear, or shared risk. It creates a calculation that every peripheral participant in a conspiracy eventually has to make privately. Is staying silent still worth it? That calculation changes when the number gets large enough. And $1 million is large enough for almost anyone to begin asking questions they were not asking before. Now consider the forensic genealogy dimension of the DNA evidence. Traditional criminal databases depend on prior arrests or existing sample collection. But forensic genealogy operates on an entirely different framework. It does not require the individual to have ever been in a law enforcement database. It requires only that a biological relative, somewhere in a family tree, has contributed genetic material to a genealogical database. And those databases are vast. Millions of profiles, millions of family connections, millions of potential bridges between an unidentified DNA sample and a living, locatable individual. This means someone who has never been arrested in their life, someone who has never had any prior interaction with law enforcement, could still be identified through a cousin, a sibling, a parent, a distant relative who submitted a sample to an ancestry platform years ago, without ever imagining it would one day contribute to a federal investigation. That is not a theoretical possibility in this case. That is a reported investigative direction. And if it is accurate, then whoever left biological material at the scene or on associated evidence may not be protected by the absence of a prior criminal record. They may be protected by nothing at all except time. And time, in a case where genealogical reconstruction is actively underway, is not an ally. It is a countdown. Now add the digital forensic layer. Phones carry location metadata. Navigation systems log route histories. Bluetooth connections record device pairings. Cloud backups preserve deleted content. Messaging applications retain communication records even when users believe they have been erased. These are not speculative capabilities. These are standard tools in federal digital forensic investigations. And here is the critical reality that many people involved in serious crimes still fail to fully absorb. Digital systems do not lie. They do not misremember. They do not get nervous under questioning. They simply record. And then they wait. Quietly, patiently, inside devices that their owners may have long since stopped worrying about. Now bring it all together. The glove, the DNA, the genealogy, the digital records, the reward pressure, the new surveillance footage. Each of these evidence streams exists independently. Each of them alone may not be sufficient to close the case. But that is not how major federal investigations work. They do not depend on singular breakthroughs. They depend on convergence. And the convergence in Nancy Guthrie's case may be closer than the public silence around it suggests. Because when investigators reportedly described the new footage as stunning, that word did not come from a case that was stagnant. It came from a case that was moving. Quietly, methodically, and with the kind of sustained institutional force that does not announce itself before it is ready. Whatever that footage contains, it did not arrive in isolation. It arrived as one more piece pressing into place inside a framework that may already be close to complete. And for whoever is responsible for what happened to Nancy Guthrie, the most dangerous moment in any long investigation is not the first week. It is not the first month. It is the moment when every independent line of evidence stops pointing in different directions and starts pointing at the same place. That moment may be arriving.
Several firearms experts say he's armed with what appears to be a 9mm handgun, possibly a Glock, and those gloves are made of a synthetic rubber called nitrile. Nitrile gloves like these are often worn by plumbers and gas station employees because they don't disintegrate when they come in contact with oil and other chemicals.
There is a particular kind of pressure that builds inside a major investigation that the public almost never gets to see. It does not look like urgency from the outside. It does not announce itself. It does not appear in press conferences or news briefings. It lives entirely inside sealed case files, forensic laboratory reports, and the quiet, relentless accumulation of evidence that investigators have been building since the morning Nancy Guthrie was first reported missing. But pressure does not need to be visible to be real. And in Nancy Guthrie's case, the pressure is real. Consider what law enforcement is now reportedly working with. A behavioral baseline established by the hired vehicle footage from January 31st, pre-crime surveillance evidence potentially captured on footage from as early as January 11th. A physical evidence trail anchored by the glove found 2 miles from her home. Multiple unidentified DNA profiles under active forensic development, including potential genealogical reconstruction. Digital forensic material from phones, navigation systems, and connected devices. $1 million reward structure applying continuous financial pressure to anyone with peripheral knowledge. And now, new surveillance footage that analysts have described as stunning. That is not a weak case. That is a case being built layer by layer, with the kind of structural depth that does not collapse under cross-examination. Now think about what that environment feels like for anyone who knows something about what happened to Nancy Guthrie. Every day without a public arrest does not mean safety. Every day without a public announcement does not mean investigators have moved on. In cases operating under federal jurisdiction, silence is often strategic. Evidence is preserved. Witnesses are protected. Forensic results are held until the prosecutorial architecture is strong enough to withstand challenge. What looks like stagnation from the outside is often construction on the inside. And construction, when it reaches completion, does not give advance warning. Nancy Guthrie was a mother, a grandmother, a woman whose family has spent months suspended in the specific, devastating uncertainty that only a disappearance creates. Not the finality of confirmed loss. Not the relief of answers. Just an open question that sits in the center of every day, every conversation, every moment when someone reaches for a phone to call her and then remembers. She is still missing. And the people who love her are still waiting. That human reality sits beneath every forensic detail in this case. It is easy to get absorbed in the investigative complexity, in the timelines and the DNA and the surveillance architecture, and lose sight of the fact that at the center of all of it is an 84-year-old woman who went to dinner with her family and never came home. Her life mattered before this case made headlines. It matters now not because of the investigation, but because of who she was. Independent. Sharp. Beloved. The kind of person whose absence reshapes the daily lives of everyone around her in ways that no amount of investigative progress can fully repair. Now here is what convergence looks like in real terms. Cases like this do not break through dramatic confrontations. They break through accumulated pressure reaching a point where concealment becomes structurally impossible. A genealogical match that identifies a previously unknown suspect. A digital record that places a specific device at a specific location at a specific time. A witness whose silence finally costs more than speaking. A financial transaction that places someone where they claimed not to be. A single oversight in an otherwise carefully constructed plan. Strategic crimes require systems. And systems have failure points. The more elaborate the system, the more failure points it contains. And the longer a federal investigation runs with sustained resources and expanding evidence, the greater the probability that one of those failure points eventually gives way. The new surveillance footage may be that point. If what investigators are reportedly seeing in those frames confirms a specific presence in Nancy Guthrie's environment before her disappearance, if it places a face or a vehicle or a behavioral pattern in a location it should not have been, then the architecture of this crime may be facing its most serious challenge yet. Because pre-crime evidence does not just identify suspects. It eliminates the possibility of coincidence. It removes the defense of wrong place, wrong time.
His clothes are also producing intriguing clues. That ski mask has unique stitching. Notice the seams around the eyes and mouth. It's just like this mask, which can be bought for $22. The holster isn't fancy at all. It's made of nylon and sells at sporting goods stores in Tucson, also for $22.
It says, clearly and visually, that someone was there before the crime, during the period when the crime was being prepared, and that their presence was not accidental. That kind of evidence does not leave much room. And if it connects to the DNA, if it connects to the digital records, if it connects to the route suggested by the discarded glove, if it connects to the behavioral timeline established by the January surveillance requests, then what investigators may be holding right now is not just a stunning piece of footage. It may be the final key. The silence surrounding Nancy Guthrie's case is not empty. It is full of forensic work still underway, full of investigative threads still being pulled, full of pressure still building on every person who knows more than they have said. And somewhere inside that silence, the answer to what happened on the night of January 31st, 2026, and in the weeks quietly leading up to it, may already exist in documented form, waiting for the right moment to become public. Nancy Guthrie left for dinner believing she was safe. She had no reason to think otherwise. She rode through her city in the early evening, calm, present, ordinary. And if the new footage contains what investigators reportedly believe it contains, then that ride captured something the person responsible for her disappearance never accounted for. The simple, permanent truth of being seen. Cameras do not negotiate. They do not respond to pressure or fear or planning. They simply record the world as it is, not as anyone needs it to appear. And in a case built on concealment, on preparation, on the deliberate elimination of visibility, the one thing no amount of planning can fully control is the lens that was already running before anyone knew to look for it. The investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance is not over, but it may be closer to its final chapter than anyone responsible for it ever expected. And in the next video, the focus shifts to something investigators have been quietly examining alongside the footage, a specific detail connected to the timeline of January 23rd that has reportedly caused significant recalibration inside the case. A detail that did not make headlines, a detail that most people following this case have never heard. But a detail that, according to sources, may represent the single clearest indication yet of exactly how long this was being planned, and by how many people. That story is coming. And if you have been following this case, you cannot afford to miss it. The dinner ended. The car pulled away. And Nancy Guthrie came home. That part everyone knows. What most people have not fully absorbed is what the hours after her return actually looked like from an investigative standpoint. Because when detectives began reconstructing the timeline of January 31st into the early hours of February 1st, what emerged was not a chaotic picture. It was a disturbingly structured one. And structured timelines in disappearance cases do not happen by accident. Nancy arrived home at approximately 9:48 in the evening. Tommaso Sion, her son-in-law, was there. He was publicly identified as the last known person to see her alive. That detail alone has carried enormous weight throughout this investigation because the final witness in any disappearance case occupies a unique position. They hold the last version of normal, the last image of someone before the record goes dark. At 9:50, the garage sequence completed. 2 minutes. That was the gap between her return and the closing of that garage. Investigators have reportedly examined that 2-minute window with extraordinary precision because 2 minutes is not nothing. 2 minutes is enough time for a great many things to either begin or finalize. The door closed, and then the house went quiet. For the next several hours, from the outside, nothing appeared wrong. The neighborhood was still. The property sat undisturbed, at least visibly. No alarms, no calls. No indication that anything inside that home was anything other than an elderly woman settling in for the night after a family dinner. But appearances in this case have repeatedly proven to be unreliable narrators. Because at 1:47 in the morning, something happened to the surveillance visibility around Nancy Guthrie's property. A disruption. The kind that does not occur randomly. The kind that, in the context of everything else investigators were piecing together, began to look less like a coincidence and more like a deliberate step in a sequence that had already been mapped out in advance.
Unfortunately, the infrared video does not reveal color. Forensic video analyst Connor McCourt tells our Allison Hall.
That jacket may appear gray in this video, it's not necessarily gray.
Think about that for a moment. Surveillance disruption at 1:47 in the morning does not suggest panic. Panic does not plan around security systems. Panic does not time itself to a specific hour. What surveillance disruption at 1:47 in the morning suggests is awareness. Awareness of the system. Awareness of what the system could record. And a deliberate decision to neutralize that recording capability before the most critical moments occurred. That is not impulsive behavior. That is preparation meeting execution. And then, at approximately 2:28 in the morning, Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker transmitted what investigators believe was its final meaningful signal. The device inside her chest, the one designed to monitor and support her heart, went effectively silent. And from that point forward, the trail that technology had been quietly maintaining simply stopped. No more signal. No more digital confirmation of her location or her condition. Just absence. Now here is what that sequence tells investigators. Between 9:50 at night and 2:28 in the morning, there was a window of roughly 4.5 hours. A window during which something occurred inside and around that property that has not been fully explained publicly. A window that begins with the garage door closing and ends with a medical device going silent. And somewhere inside that window, the investigation strongly suggests Nancy Guthrie's life was taken out of her own hands. The question was never really what happened inside that window. The question was always who put the window there in the first place. Because windows like that do not appear on their own. They are created. They are calculated. Someone had to know the surveillance layout. Someone had to understand the timing. Someone had to be aware of the pacemaker and what its signal meant as a tracking mechanism. Someone had to account for all of those variables and build a plan around them. That level of awareness does not come from a single evening of observation. It comes from study. And that realization, more than any other single element of this case, is what began pulling investigators backward in time. Not forward. Backward. Away from February 1st. Away from the garage and the silent pacemaker and the disrupted cameras. Backward into the weeks before. Into the quiet days when Nancy Guthrie was simply living her life, completely unaware that her life had potentially become something else to someone watching from a distance. A blueprint. And here is the detail that changes the emotional weight of everything that came before. Nancy reportedly displayed no visible anxiety during her final ride. She was calm. She was present. She had dinner with her family. She came home. She walked into her garage. She closed the door. She felt safe. Whatever danger was already surrounding her on the evening of January 31st, it had not yet shown itself to her. It was patient. It was quiet. It was waiting. And that means the woman captured on that hired vehicle footage was not moving toward a threat she could sense. She was moving through a threat she could not see at all. That is perhaps the most haunting truth in this entire case. Not the timeline. Not the forensics. Not the investigative complexity. The fact that she had no idea. Now the investigation had a surface. And beneath that surface, something far larger was beginning to take shape. When federal investigators began formally requesting surveillance footage from dates that preceded Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, the significance of that decision was not immediately understood by the public. Dates like January 11th, January 23rd. Days that, on the surface, appeared to have nothing to do with the night Nancy vanished. Days that fell weeks before February 1st, before the garage sequence, before the pacemaker silence, before any of it. Law enforcement does not request prior weeks of footage without a reason. That is not how these investigations work. Detectives operating under federal resources do not cast wide nets randomly across calendar dates. They request specific footage from specific windows because something, either a witness statement, a digital flag, a behavioral anomaly, or a pattern detected in existing evidence has pointed them there. Those requests are surgical. They are intentional. And when those dates fell in the weeks before Nancy disappeared, investigators were effectively signaling one thing. They believed something had been happening before February 1st. Something that looked ordinary to everyone except the person doing it. Now consider what pre-crime observation of Nancy Guthrie's life would have looked like in practice. She was 84 years old. She was independent and routine-driven. She had occupied the same home for decades. Her patterns were established. Her schedule was readable. Her neighborhood had rhythms that a careful observer could learn over time without ever drawing attention to themselves. When does she leave the house? When does she return? How long is she alone? When do family members visit? How visible is the property from the street? What are the blind spots in the security coverage? How responsive are the neighbors? What time does the neighborhood go quiet? These are not questions born from impulse. These are operational questions. The kind of patient, deliberate accumulation of information about a person who has no idea she is being observed. And if investigators found reason to believe that kind of observation was underway weeks before Nancy vanished, then the case shifted from a disappearance investigation into something with a much darker architecture. Because it would mean the danger in Nancy Guthrie's life did not begin when she walked into her garage on the night of January 31st. It began much earlier. Some things never make sense until they're too late to change. Nancy Guthrie left her Tucson home on the evening of January 31st, 2026, the way she had left it hundreds of times before. Quietly, independently, without fear. She was 84 years old. Sharp, familiar with her own rhythms. A woman who had built decades of routine into something that felt like armor. And on that particular Friday evening, nothing around her suggested that armor was about to mean nothing at all. A hired vehicle arrived. She got in. She rode to dinner. That was it. That was the whole picture from the outside. But somewhere inside a federal investigation that has grown into one of the most closely watched disappearance cases in modern Arizona history, that simple ride has become anything but ordinary. Because investigators have reportedly obtained new surveillance footage connected to Nancy Guthrie's final hours. And according to sources tied to the case, what that footage contains has left analysts stunned. Not horrified, not confused, stunned. There is a difference. And that difference is everything. When law enforcement uses that kind of language, it does not mean they saw chaos. It means they saw something they were not fully prepared for. Something that shifted the trajectory of the investigation in a direction that changes how every prior piece of evidence now has to be read. Hi viewers, here is a question that has been dividing people following this case since the very beginning, and there is no wrong answer. Do you believe Nancy Guthrie's disappearance was planned in advance, or do you think it was a crime of opportunity? Drop your answer in the comments right now, because what this footage reportedly reveals may completely change how you see that question. Now here is what is known. At approximately 5:32 in the evening on January 31st, Nancy departed her home in a quiet Tucson neighborhood. Her destination was a family dinner, a routine gathering, the kind of evening that leaves no trace in memory because nothing about it was supposed to matter beyond the meal and the conversation and the drive home. She was recorded inside that hired vehicle. Federal agents reportedly reviewed that footage early in the investigation. And what analysts described was not a woman in distress. Not a woman scanning her surroundings with any visible unease. What they saw was Nancy Guthrie in one of the most ordinary emotional states a person can occupy. Calm, present, entirely unaware that anything was wrong. That detail is not minor. In disappearance investigations, victim behavior in the final documented hours carries enormous psychological weight. When a person has no visible anxiety, no behavioral shift, no instinctive guardedness, it tells investigators something critical about the nature of the threat itself. It was hidden. It was not telegraphed. Whatever danger was moving toward Nancy Guthrie on the evening of January 31st, it was not visible to her. She could not see it coming. And that is precisely what makes the new footage so significant. because investigators are not reportedly stunned by her calmness. That part was already known. They are reportedly stunned by something else entirely. Something in that footage that was not the focus when it was first reviewed. Something that only became visible once investigators knew exactly what they were looking for. Something in the background. Nancy spent that evening at a family gathering. Witnesses who were present described the dinner as calm and entirely routine. No tension. No unusual incidents. No sign that the woman sitting at that table was moving through what would become the final documented ordinary hours of her life. She returned home at approximately 9:48 in the evening. Her son-in-law, Tommaso Sion, was publicly identified as the last known person to see her alive. 2 minutes later, at 9:50, the garage sequence completed. The door closed. And then the night went quiet in a way it was never supposed to go quiet again. By 1:47 in the morning, surveillance visibility around the property was critically disrupted. By approximately 2:28 in the morning, the pacemaker Nancy Guthrie carried inside her chest transmitted what investigators believe was its final meaningful signal. After that, silence. Digital silence. Physical silence. The kind of silence that does not come from peace. Now think carefully about what that timeline means. Between 9:50 at night and 2:28 in the morning, something happened inside and around that home that has never been fully explained to the public. A window of roughly 4.5 hours. And somewhere within that window, the investigation believes, Nancy Guthrie's life moved from ordinary into something investigators are still working to fully reconstruct. That is the timeline everyone has been studying. But the new footage does not live inside that window. It lives before it. Hours before it. And what it may contain, according to sources, is not evidence of what happened after Nancy returned home. It may be evidence of what was already being positioned before she ever got back. That distinction is what has left investigators stunned. Because a crime captured in its active phase is one kind of case. But a crime captured in its preparation phase, before the moment of execution, before the visible act, that is a different kind of case entirely. That is a case where investigators are no longer asking only what happened. They're asking who planned it, when the planning began, and whether that plan is now, finally, visible on camera. The answer to that last question may have just changed. And if sources are accurate about what this new footage contains, then Nancy Guthrie's final ride to dinner was not simply the last peaceful chapter of her life. It may have been the moment the entire hidden architecture of her disappearance was unknowingly recorded. Not by accident. Not by luck. By the simple, relentless truth that cameras do not forget.